Well, good morning. I'm happy to be here today. Blaze is closed today. So we do need teachers. That's not a joke. The reason that we close it, I just want to say real quick, the reason we close it is because, we're here to take care of the family, right? So that means taking care of our volunteers and taking care of our kids. So if that means that we have to close because we don't have the volunteers, that's what we're going to do. So we'd love to have you join and do it. We make it pretty easy as far as volunteers and what to do. We'll walk you through it. We'll help you do it. A lot of people have joined recently, nursery and even some helpers in Blaze and stuff. So you can talk to them and how it's going, but it's generally a blessing and it's not too difficult to do. So me and my wife love doing it, and you can ask my wife. She'll say that some of her favorite Sundays is being back with them because kids are just so black and white and so transparent, and it's, you know what you're dealing with all the time. So it's really nice. So if you're interested in that, please come talk to me. Same thing with check-in. We need a check-in person. Also, really easy job. You just greet parents and help them feel loved and explain to how we do kids. So it's pretty relaxed, and you get to sit back there and watch the service on a screen, and it's pretty nice. So if you're interested, let me know. I'd be happy to have you. As far as the kids that are left in here, this is stuff for you guys too, because normally I speak to you anyway, so it's kind of the same, really. So, but last time I spoke, I talked about what is true obedience. And that's what God's been talking to me a lot about. And I think it's because he's calling DCC to something bigger than we've ever been before. And when God calls us to something bigger, a lot of times that means lining up with him, which is what obedience is, right? So that's why I feel like he's really been speaking to me about obedience. And so last time we talked about the two sons and we basically learned about how it's not okay to just say the right thing or look the right way. You have to line up your behavior to match it. And we talked about that third son who chooses to wake up every day asking God, what do you have for me today? And that's what God's calling us to. So today I want to look at obedience from a kind of a different angle, because last time we talked about obeying God because God has authority over our lives, right? And kind of lining up our will with that. But some of the reason why we don't obey is not always because we don't have the will for it. Sometimes it's because all the other things get in the way, especially fear. And the reason that I call it Mission Impossible is because God is always calling us to something that's impossible for us. That's why that's his whole thing, right? Because if it was possible for us to just do it, we would just do it by ourselves and we wouldn't really need to talk to him. But God wants to do it with us, which is why he gives us impossible things. It's on purpose. So I came up with the idea of Mission Impossible, and my first idea for a graphic was a little different. This is my first idea. I think that's pretty good. Christian made this for me and really indulged me with it. But I thought it would be a little distracting, so I said, let's switch it back to the other one. We'll sit with that one. But so that's kind of where my head's at with this whole thing. But so I want to talk about this idea of walking out the impossible, and I want to talk about it through the lens of a couple different characters in the Bible. Kind of, I think characters that kind of get overshadowed because of who they're around. But I love side characters because I don't think I'm a main character. I think I'm a side character. So it feels good to see how God interacts with the side characters. So we're going to be talking about a couple side characters, Saul and his son Jonathan, King Saul, and kind of exploring how they face impossible situations and what we can learn about their approaches to them. So the passages the story we're gonna be looking at is basically from 1 Samuel 9 through 1 Samuel 14, and that whole story. We're not gonna read the whole thing, but that's where we're kind of pulling this story from. If you want to read it, it's a great story. A lot of cool things happen. A lot of crazy stuff happens. It's fun, but we're gonna be looking at that. And so I want to start out with talking about Saul's call to being king. So King Saul didn't start out King Saul. King Saul started out as a kid who was sent to go find lost donkeys. That's where his story starts. That's where we learn about him. So just kind of like David, the next king, he was a herdsman, right? And so he took care of animals. And in Saul's case, he took care of donkeys. And his dad had lost some donkeys. And so he sent Saul to go find these donkeys. And Saul goes and looks all over the place, doesn't find them. And then finally they say, you know what? I heard there's this prophet, this great prophet, they called him the seer, and it's Samuel, and he lives around here. Why don't we ask him if he knows where the donkeys are? And if he doesn't know, then we're good, we'll go home, because we've looked enough. And so unbeknownst to Saul, Samuel was told by God, this guy named Saul is going to show up looking for donkeys, and he's going to be the first king of Israel. And I want you to anoint him, and I want you to tell him this. So Saul shows up to ask about donkeys, and Samuel says, why don't we not worry about the donkeys? Come have dinner with me, spend some time with me, and then we'll talk. So he has dinner with him, brings Saul up on this rooftop early in the morning, and anoints him king. He pours oil on him just like he did with David and anoints him king. And he sends him off on this journey to where they're gonna crown him king. And he sends him on this really cool journey. Samuel prays over him, and the Spirit of God comes and lives inside Saul. He gives him these signs that he's going to go on this journey, and he's going to run into these prophets, and he's going to start prophesying. And it's really interesting because in Samuel 10:9, it says, as Saul turned to leave and go do what Samuel told him to do, God changed Saul's heart. The Spirit of God came powerfully upon him, and he joined in their prophesying. Right? So he has got the Spirit of God living inside of him. He's got this mandate to go be king. He's got the backing of the great seer and the backing of God, clearly, through these signs. And I think it matters to talk about how Saul's story starts, because really we have more in common with Saul than I think we think we do, right? We have the Spirit of God inside of us. We have a call just like he did. Saul's story doesn't start out with failure. It starts out with grace, just like our stories, and supernatural power, just like our story. In fact, it says that Saul's transformation is so massive and so immediate that everybody who knew Saul before meets him and goes, is this Saul? This is weird. He's different. They thought, is he a prophet now? What's going on? But at the same time, Saul knows that he's really just a donkey farmer, okay? That's how Saul sees himself. And he's being asked to become king, which is a huge task. And not only king, but the first king. So he's got to build this thing out from scratch. And so this is the moment where fear comes in. Because Saul was afraid, and really in one sense, I understand why he was afraid, because he had reason to be, right? It's a big thing. This random guy is supposed to collect out all the tribes of Israel and bring them under his umbrella. How is he supposed to do that? But when God gets a hold of our life, it's the same thing. God's asking us to do the impossible. I always say that there's 3 things that you agree to before you have any idea what you're getting involved in, no matter how well prepared you think you are. And that is marriage and kids and Jesus. You don't know what you're agreeing to, okay? And that's not a bad thing, but I'm just saying that's the reality. That's the reality. Because God calls his people to let go of everything that's familiar, to walk by faith, not by sight. That's not an easy one. Forgive when wounded, surrender control, be holy as God is holy. That's what Jesus says. And live beyond their natural strength. These are all things that are by nature not possible. In Matthew 19:26, it says, with man, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible. 2 Corinthians 3:5, I love this. Paul's talking about his ministry. And he says, it's not that we are competent in ourselves, but our competence comes from God. Because Paul understood it's not about his ability. Paul was a great teacher. He was a wise man. He knew it wasn't enough for what God was calling him to. And even Jesus says in John 15:5, he says, apart from me, you can do nothing. He doesn't say you can do some things. He says you can do nothing. So the call of God is not possible in and of ourselves, but that's by design. God calls us into places where dependence on him is absolutely necessary. So if God is calling us to the impossible, the question isn't whether God can do it or not. The question is, what do we do in the face of it? So let's look at what Saul and Jonathan do to answer that question. Saul, like I said, as soon as he realizes the implication of what he's called to, fear sets in, and you see it in the story. He does all the signs that Samuel says, and everything happens exactly as God said it would happen. And they collect all the tribes of Israel, all the representatives of the tribes of Israel, and they're going to crown a new king. And Samuel doesn't just tell them that Saul's going to be king. They cast lots, which is a way that they used to do to show that God was in a decision, okay? And so they cast lots, and it gets down to his tribe and his family, and then all of a sudden to him, and they go, oh, Saul, where's Saul? Let's crown him king. But then they go, wait, where is Saul? Where is Saul? And everybody starts looking for Saul, and they can't find Saul. And in fact, Samuel has to ask God, we lost Saul. Where'd he go? And so God says, well, he's actually hiding in the supply tent. You're going to have to go get him. And so they do. They go and get him. They go and kind of drag him out and bring him up, and they crown him king. But I think it's interesting that Saul is hiding in the supply tent, right? That is the actions of somebody who is afraid. You know, and maybe he's afraid of what a lot of us are afraid of, right? Fear of responsibility. What if I screw this up? What if I'm not equal to the task? What if I just don't want all this responsibility at all? But that's what fear does in the face of the impossible. It causes us to run away, to hide, to freeze up, and to reject what God has for us. Because God can do the impossible, but he won't violate your will. He'll ask you. He won't force you. So we can stop God from doing things. We're the ones that can get in the way of what's possible. And Saul really becomes this picture of spiritual paralysis. You know, he's been anointed and changed and powered, yet he still shrinks back. And that continues to happen over and over in the story. You know, he's king. His main job is defending Israel, and the Philistines are the big enemy at the time, and they're running raids all over Israel and stealing and killing and destroying. And in Samuel 14:2, where is Saul? He's sitting under a pomegranate tree, just waiting around, hoping the problem goes away, I guess. I don't know. He's just sitting there with the few men he has left because they all ran away because they were afraid. And again, I don't want to dog on Saul because the reality is they had reason to be afraid. They had reason to be afraid. There's a lot of things we're afraid of. It's because they're scary. It's because we have a reason to be afraid. Historically, in this part of Israel's history, the Philistines were very smart, and they were the main enemies of Israel. And they went in and they killed or captured every blacksmith in Israel. So they didn't have any weapons. Israel didn't have any weapons. In fact, it says in the Bible that they only had two guys who had weapons, and that was Jonathan and Saul. Everybody else just used farm equipment to fight against this army with all the weapons, right? So they're afraid. They're afraid, and they have reason to be afraid. But then we get to see a contrast in the story, and that's in Jonathan. So Saul is sitting there around with his men, being afraid. And Jonathan looks at his armor bearer and he says, yeah, the odds look bad, except God, right? Except God. Jonathan decides that he and his armor bearer They're the only ones who aren't scared, so they're just going to go attack the Philistines, just the two of them. They'll handle it. And I love, Jonathan says to his armor bearer, perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or few. And his armor bearer says, I'm with you, body and soul. That's what he says. I love that. So they get up and go. So why did Jonathan and his armor bearer see the situation completely differently than everybody else? Everyone else saw an army that outnumbered and outclassed them, and they either ran away or they froze up. Jonathan sees one God of the universe versus people. That's what he saw. And I even love it too because Jonathan he says, maybe God will do something. Maybe we'll get to be a part of it. They're looking at the same enemy, the same battlefield, the same possible odds, but they just interpret it through faith. And the difference between fear and faith is that fear paralyzes us and faith energizes us. It gets us up and gets us moving. Because Jonathan knew what Saul's call was, and he had the same call because he's Saul's son, was to defeat the enemies of Israel. So he said, well, that's my calling. I don't know how this is going to work, but we got to do it. And I think it's also interesting too that Jonathan's faith didn't mean that he was certain in the outcome. I think that word perhaps there that he says is very important. Because he's not even presuming that it's going to work out. He's just looking at what he's called to, and he's just deciding to do it regardless of the outcome. Which is beautiful, which is powerful. Faith isn't certainty in outcomes. It's confidence in God's ability, even without our control. Hebrews 11:1 says, faith is confidence in what we hope for. Daniel 3, this reminded me of Daniel 3 when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are going to be thrown into the fiery furnace. And what do they say? They say, our God is able to save us, but even if he doesn't, we're going to make the same choice. Yeah. And that's what Jonathan did. He said, even if God doesn't do anything, maybe he will. That'd be awesome. But I'm going to go anyway. So Jonathan, his armor bearer, there's this outpost the Philistines have. And in order to get up to it, it's kind of this outlook in the mountains. They have to crawl on their hands and feet to try to get up to it, okay? And it says there's a cliff on both sides, okay? And one is called it's called the Shiny Cliff or something. And it's basically just a sheer drop off. And the other one has a bunch of thorns in it. So they're really between a rock and a hard place, climbing up to the Philistines. Meanwhile, the Philistines actually are seeing them and yelling down at them, yeah, come on up here. We'll finish off the job. If you make it up, we'll kill you. That's what's happening. And they're climbing up it. Talk about a stressful climb. On their hands and knees, between them, they have a spear and a sword, and that's it. But they're going to take out this outpost. That's what they're going to do. But they do it. They get to the top, and they start fighting these Philistines, and somehow, just the two of them kill 20 Philistines. And I think it's interesting too, because I love seeing like how God does with different situations. And you have these two guys, God knows what he's going to do, but he lets Jonathan and his armor bearer climb up there, fight, right? Fighting is hard work. It's dangerous. I'm sure they got hurt. He lets them fight. They fight 20 guys, kill these 20 guys. And then God steps in and says, all right, you guys did enough. I'll take the rest. And God puts the fear of God into these Philistines. And they are so chaotic and so terrified that they start killing each other. And it's only at that point when Saul and the rest of the army go, wait, what's happening? Why is there all this noise? And they look out and they go, oh, our enemy's killing each other. We should probably go finish the job. And they joined in then and won the day. But it was only Jonathan stepping out that was the catalyst of that. Yeah, and God let him climb that mountain on his hands and feet. God let him fight those men before he stepped in. So Saul is paralyzed by fear, and Jonathan is energized by faith and trust in his Creator. But there's something else we can see in these passages that I think is interesting about fear and faith. Because fear doesn't always just paralyze us. Sometimes it does something that can be way more dangerous. It can make us try to take control. And Saul struggled with this as well. And this is where Saul became even more destructive in his life. When the pressure comes, Saul doesn't seek God. He starts to manage outcomes. And real quick, I want to give a couple examples of this so you can see it. In Samuel 11, Saul is supposed to rally his troops. It's his first act as king, the first battle that they're going to do. And instead of rallying his troops with like, God, how do you want us to defeat this enemy, right? Like Gideon did. Instead of casting the vision of we're God's people, who could stand against us? No, he takes a cow and he cuts it up into pieces. He sends it to all the tribes and says, this is what I'm going to do to your livestock if you don't show up. That doesn't really seem like a God thing to do. That seems like we really need this to work out, so you better show up. That's a fear response. In Samuel 13, Saul is told to wait for 7 days before he attacks the enemy because Samuel's going to come and they're going to offer sacrifices and listen to God. Again, seek God. Well, what does he do? He waits till the morning of the 7th day. His men are starting to leave because they're scared. They're starting to run away. And so he's afraid they're all going to run away. So he waits till the morning of the 7th day and does the sacrifices himself exactly the way God told him not to. Because he was afraid, because that was the thing he could do. Samuel 14, the next chapter, the story we just talked about with Jonathan. As they do this big victory and they chase the Philistines out, because of Saul's, again, desire to control, he makes this command of his soldiers, and it ends up derailing the entire battle. They end up having a little trial in the woods instead of fighting their enemies, and it derails the whole thing because he tried to control. He does what a lot of us do, really, because when we're really pressed, sometimes we just make it happen, right? So often when God calls us to something impossible, our instinct is not to surrender, it's to control. Whether it's controlling people or outcomes or timelines or appearances, we want to control. Because fear causes you to focus on what can I do, not what can God do. And really, because Saul was so focused on the right outcome that he wanted, he didn't get to be a part of what God was doing. He missed out on his real calling. And then we get to see Jonathan again as a contrast. Jonathan didn't just trust God on the battlefield. Jonathan trusted God with his future. As the story goes on, God says that Saul is going to be replaced as king. David is anointed as king. And when Jonathan finds out David is anointed as king, what that means practically is that he lost his inheritance. Jonathan lost his inheritance because of his father's actions. It's not even his own actions. Now, I personally think Jonathan would be a great king. I love Jonathan. He's like one of my favorite characters. But that's not what happened. And traditionally, in the ancient world, if a king changed family lines, they killed all the other family line, all right? So Jonathan, this isn't happy news in any way that David is going to be king. But what does Jonathan do? There's not a single passage where Jonathan gripes about not being king. He supports David. He lets go of his expectations. He loves David. He saves David's life. He recognizes that what God says is more important than his expectations for how things should be.
Amen. That's so good.
That is the definition of faith. Faith doesn't cling on when God says to release it. It doesn't hold on when God says surrender. And Jonathan stayed faithful to his father, and he served his father well, but he never stopped serving his Lord and God first. Saul, on the other hand, when he finds out David's supposed to be king, what does he do? He hangs on to it. He says, I'm going to be king regardless of what God says. He's driven by fear and madness and chaos instead of pursuing what God has for him. And I think it's interesting too with Saul. I was thinking about this the other day. Saul was king for 15 years after he was replaced. For 15 years. God didn't just kick him out. No, he was king for 15 years. He spent that 15 years chasing David around in the woods, not doing what God called him to do. What would have happened if he would have just repented and said, God, yeah, I chose my own security instead of what you wanted me to do? What would have happened? He could have been a great king if he would have followed God, but his fear was what drove him. Jesus says, whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. And Jesus himself, before the cross, right? He said, not my will, but yours, God. Even Jesus gave up control in light of the Father. So fear tries to control and faith surrenders. So if faith energizes and surrenders, how do we actually become people like that? Because that kind of faith doesn't just show up when you're in a crisis, right? It's cultivated before that. So I want to look at 3 things that we can do to really cultivate faith like that and build deep roots of faith. I think it's interesting. The first one, we actually see it in the story of Saul's kingship. And back in 1 Samuel 10, Samuel is anointing Saul king in front of Israel. And it says in verse 25, Samuel explained to the people the rights and duties of kingship. He wrote them down on a scroll and deposited before the Lord. Now, when Samuel did that, he most likely took those from Deuteronomy 17, which is Moses wrote down, what do you do when you get a king? Okay? It's instructions for how to be a king of Israel. And I want to read part of that because I think it's very relevant for what we're talking about. So Deuteronomy 17, verse 18, it says, when he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law. So that's what he's supposed to do. The king is supposed to handwrite a copy of the first 5 books of the Bible. Which is a pretty big task, but that's what they tell him to do. Taken from that of the Levitical priests. It is to be with him, and it is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of his law and his decrees. I think it's safe to say, based on Saul's behavior, he didn't do that. He didn't spend every day leaning into understanding who God was, spending time in his word. He doesn't actually live like God is God. By contrast, Jonathan, we don't get to see a lot of his diary, but by his actions, he was 100% sure about who God was. That's why he said God doesn't need an army. He knew his history. He knew the words of Moses. He knew who God really was. If we don't know the character of God, we will interpret every impossible situation through fear. It's just the way it is. We need to know who God is. And the best way to know who God is to spend time in his word. There's no replacement for that. And we talk a lot about listening and all that kind of stuff. I hope you understand it's always in the context of the word of God as the base for everything we say and everything we do. The reason we can hear is because we spend time in the word. That's how it's supposed to work. Romans 10:17 says, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word about Christ. Psalms 119, your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. I love that one because a lamp doesn't really show that far. You know, we need to be constantly engaged with the word to see where we're going. You don't like read a passage and be like, well, I'm good for a week and we'll talk. No, it's spending time in the word. Joshua 1:8, this is instructions for Joshua. He says, keep this book of the law always on your lips. So speaking it, meditate on it day and night, thinking about it, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. So again, he's speaking it, he's thinking on it, he's living it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. But you know, understanding the word is also not quite enough. There are people in the Bible, the Pharisees are the biggest example, right? They knew every word of the Bible. They knew all of it. They had it memorized, most of them. But what's the difference? God isn't just inviting us into knowledge. He's inviting us into relationship. King Saul had a lot of spiritual experiences. You know, he prophesied, he was anointed, the Spirit lived inside of him. But the broad pattern of his life is not a relational dependence on God. There's never a time in these passages where he just goes and asks God what to do. I looked because I wanted to know. One time he asks God what he's supposed to do. One time. And that's because a priest is like, maybe you should ask God what we're supposed to be doing here. That's the one time he asks. Otherwise, he's just doing his thing. He's just going on with his life. And we can do the same thing. John 15, I think we have this one on the screen here. Yeah. Abide in me and I in you. This is Jesus talking. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine. So neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him, he bears much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. That's a relational verse. We do it all with him. We do it all with him. So the first point was getting deep roots in the word, then deep roots in relationship. And the next part is deep roots in surrender. And it's really the same thing. We need to constantly be asking God what he has for us. And, you know, when I say, because I say this a fair amount, and actually had somebody ask me about this. When I say I pray and I ask God and I listen to what he has to say, what I don't mean is that God tells me like verbally all the time what I'm supposed to do all the time. That isn't actually how it works. What I'm talking about is taking a moment and pausing when we're in a situation, and Lori is really the one who's challenged me with this as we've been married. Because, you know, when we have a disagreement about something, or sometimes it's not even a disagreement, we just have something we got to make a decision on, we just pause and we posture ourselves and we say, God, it doesn't matter what we want. It doesn't matter what we think is best. Whatever you say, that's what I'm going to do. Whatever you want, that's what I'm going to want. And we posture ourselves in that way. Proverbs 3, I think we have this one on the passage too. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him and he will make your path straight. Lean not on your own understanding. God gave us a mind, but not in replacement of surrender to him. Just like he gave us emotions. Emotions aren't bad either. God had emotions. Jesus had emotions. Neither of these things are wrong, but they're not our leader. Jesus is our leader. So it's not passive spirituality. It's active surrender is what we're called to. Romans 8:14 says, for those who are led by the Spirit are children of God. Those who are led by the Spirit. Galatians 5:25 says, since we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit. I like that one. I get the picture of like dancing. You got to keep in step, otherwise you're stepping on toes. And that posture of pausing and saying, God, you have the right to speak into this. That posture is actually more important than getting answers. Because that posture really shapes who we are. It's about God's will first, not my will. It's about God's will first, not what's most comfortable or what's the least scary or what makes sense to me. No, it's God's will first. Faith is built before the battles. It's right now that we dig those deep roots by spending time in the Word, by experiencing who Jesus is as a person, and by surrendering to him every day. So Saul and Jonathan, they were both very close to the same story. They had the same enemies, the same nation, the same God, the same impossible situations, but they just responded very differently. So when we face the impossible situation, the band can come up. When we face an impossible situation, what our first instinct should be is to say, God, this is impossible in my mind. What do we do together? And then we land on that surrender. When we live like that, there is no mission impossible. It's just following God. But that only is true if our trust in God runs deeper than our fears and our insecurities. Let's pray. God, I thank you that you're with us. I thank you that you love us. I thank you that you want to have relationship with us. You're not just a far-off king. You're a father, and a good father. I pray that you'd speak to us right now about any ways where we're letting fear, anxiety, worry get in the way of what you're trying to do in our lives so that we can be free of it. We can walk in the freedom that you've called us to. Amen.